It started with a simple stop, or at least that's what they wanted it to look like. Two small-town deputies, fueled by arrogance and prejudice, thought they could humiliate a black woman, turn her into just another forgotten headline. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. She wasn't just any woman, she was a United States Army general, and she carried something far more powerful than a badge or a gun. She carried the truth. What happened next wasn't just a confrontation, it was a collision between abuse of power and the unstoppable force of dignity, justice, and courage. And trust me, you won't believe how it all ends until you hear the whole story. So stick with us, and while you're here, let us know in the comments what time are you listening and where are you tuning in from. We'd love to hear from you. Brigadier General Ariel Hayes had driven this stretch of Highway 82 so many times she could almost map it with her eyes closed. But today felt different, quieter, somehow heavier in a way that pressed against her skin like humidity before a summer storm. The trees on either side of the two-lane road stood tall and unmoving, their thick branches reaching over the cracked asphalt like sentinels guarding a path few people cared to travel unless they absolutely had to. Ariel's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel of the silver SUV, her back straight, her eyes scanning the road ahead with the same quiet intensity that had carried her through battlefields halfway across the world. She glanced at the dashboard clock, noting the time with military precision. She was ahead of schedule, but not by much. The classified briefing at Columbus Air Force Base wasn't the kind of meeting you arrived late for, and certainly not the kind you postponed without consequences. Still, there was something unsettling about the way the signal on her secure Pentagon-issued phone kept flickering between two bars and nothing at all. She knew the area well enough to understand that cell service could be spotty at best in these rural backroads. But this wasn't just a casual phone call she was waiting to make. This was the kind of call that couldn't afford to wait. Ariel reached across the passenger seat, her fingers brushing the smooth black surface of the encrypted device, checking again for a signal that stubbornly refused to hold steady. She let out a slow, controlled breath, reminding herself that panic served no purpose, not here, not ever. As she crested a gentle hill, her sharp eyes caught sight of a weathered roadside sign, half hidden behind overgrown grass and a leaning telephone pole. Red Oak Gas and Diner Next Right. The lettering was faded, but the name stuck in her mind like a distant memory, though she was certain she'd never been here before. She had learned a long time ago that places like this rarely welcomed people like her with open arms, especially in small towns where strangers stood out more than they should. But she wasn't wearing her uniform today. Not the deep blue dress jacket with rows of medals, not the starched white blouse or the gold insignia pinned to her collar. No, today she was just another woman in jeans and a light gray blazer trying to get from one place to another without drawing attention. She signaled, easing the SUV onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching softly as she turned into the lot. The diner looked exactly like the kind of place you stopped at, not because you wanted to, but because you had no other choice. An old Pepsi sign hung crookedly above the doorway, its colors long since faded by the relentless southern sun. A single rusted gas pump stood near the edge of the lot, leaning slightly to one side, like it had long since given up trying to stay upright. Ariel pulled into a spot near the side of the building, away from the handful of pickup trucks parked haphazardly near the front entrance, where a small group of locals leaned against their vehicles, talking in low, lazy voices that carried just far enough on the sticky afternoon air. She turned off the engine, letting the sudden quiet settle over her like a second skin. Rolling her shoulders back, she reached for the phone again, stepping out into the thick heat that smelled faintly of motor oil and fried food. She paused for a moment, adjusting the cuffs of her blazer, her hands smoothing the fabric, with the kind of precision that came second nature to someone used to keeping up appearances. But this wasn't about appearances today. This was about duty, about making sure the people counting on her got the information they needed, no matter what it took. Lifting the phone to her ear, she pressed the secure connect button and spoke in the steady, clipped tone that had earned her respect in every room she'd ever walked into. Brigadier General Ariel Hayes, verifying identity, initiating secured connection. The voice on the other end responded without hesitation, confirming clearance and immediately launching into the briefing. Sensitive operations, real-time updates, things that couldn't wait. Ariel's gaze swept the parking lot, taking in every shadow, every shifting body language, every glance that lasted a second too long. And though to any outsider it looked like nothing more than a woman making a phone call at a rundown gas station, Ariel felt the air hum with something she couldn't quite name, something watching, something waiting, something she knew from experience never meant anything good. Still, she stood there, feet planted firmly on cracked asphalt, phone pressed to her ear, her mind locked on the voice relaying orders thousands of miles away. Because in that moment one truth echoed louder than all the rest: this day was far from over. Inside the diner, the air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and bacon grease that had probably been hanging in the air since sunrise. The old ceiling fan above the counter spun lazily, creaking with every slow turn, as if it too had grown tired of being here. Behind the chipped Formica counter stood Sharon Ellis, 55 years old, blonde hair pulled into a tight bun that didn't quite hide the gray roots creeping in at her temples. She wore a stiff red oak diner apron stained at the edges, like she had long since stopped caring about keeping it clean. Her lips were pressed into the kind of thin line that spoke of a lifetime spent looking down on people without ever really having the courage to say what she was thinking out loud. Sharon had worked this place for more than 20 years, and though the faces changed and the seasons came and went, she remained exactly where she had always been, watching, judging, waiting for anything interesting to break up the long stretch of nothing that defined most of her days. She leaned one elbow on the counter, her other hand slowly wiping the same spot with an already dirty rag, her eyes narrowing as they followed the woman who had just pulled up outside. There was something about the way the woman carried herself that rubbed Sharon the wrong way, though she couldn't have explained it if someone had asked. Maybe it was the way she stepped out of that shiny rental SUV like she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. Maybe it was the way her clothes didn't scream for attention but somehow made her stand out all the same. Or maybe, and Sharon hated admitting this even to herself, it was the way the woman didn't seem the least bit nervous to be the only black person standing in a parking lot full of white strangers in a town like this. Sharon had seen enough in her lifetime to trust her gut, or at least that's what she told herself. And right now her gut was telling her that this woman was trouble. Real trouble. She leaned a little closer to the window, watching as the woman raised a phone to her ear, speaking in a voice too low for Sharon to hear. But that didn't matter. Sharon didn't need to hear the words to fill in the blanks. In her mind, the story had already started writing itself. Suspicious woman, fancy car, strange behavior. With a slow breath that felt heavier than it needed to be, Sharon reached for the old landline phone mounted to the wall behind the counter. The receiver was yellowed with age, the cord stretched from years of being pulled too far. She glanced quickly around the diner, making sure none of the few customers sipping their coffee at the corner booths were paying her any attention. Then without hesitation she dialed the local sheriff's office numbers she knew by heart. When the dispatcher picked up on the second ring, Sharon lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, as if she was doing the town some great service by calling this in. "Yeah, hey, it's Sharon down at Red Oak." She began shifting her weight like she was about to share the juiciest piece of gossip this town had heard in weeks. "We got somebody out here by the pumps." Black female acting real shady, talking to herself or something. "Looks like she might be on something. Y'all better send somebody to check it out." She didn't wait for questions, didn't leave room for the dispatcher to ask for a description beyond what she had already given. Sharon hung up the phone with a slow, satisfied smirk, brushing her hands together like she'd just taken out the trash. The call had been made. The story had already begun. And Sharon, whether she would admit it or not, was feeling more alive than she had in weeks. She went back to wiping the counter, though her eyes never really left the window. Outside, the woman continued her call, pacing slowly near the rear of the SUV, her posture calm, her face unreadable. Sharon squinted, trying to catch a better look, but all she saw was a woman standing too tall, looking too sure of herself, and that was enough to make Sharon certain she had done the right thing. A soft chime rang from the front door as another customer walked in, but Sharon barely registered it. Her mind was already playing out what would happen next. She could almost hear the distant wail of sirens, almost see the cruisers pulling up in a spray of gravel, almost feel the weight of satisfaction settle in her chest when those officers stepped out and showed that woman exactly who was in charge around here. The corners of Sharon's mouth twitched just barely as she reached for the pot of stale coffee and began pouring another cup for the trucker, who had just taken a seat at the counter. He mumbled a thank you, but Sharon didn't answer. Her mind was already somewhere else, standing in that parking lot, watching the scene unfold in her imagination like it was already real. And in a way, to Sharon Ellis, it already was. On the other side of town, just beyond the railroad tracks, where the road curved past an empty grain silo, a black and white patrol cruiser sat parked in the shade of an old oak tree. Inside the vehicle, Deputy Hank Wheeler leaned back in the driver's seat, his thick arms folded across his chest, the brim of his department-issued hat tilted low over his eyes. The Mississippi heat pressed through the cracked window like a heavy blanket, but Wheeler didn't seem to mind. He had spent most of his adult life sweating in uniforms that never quite fit right, answering calls that rarely amounted to anything worth writing up in a report. Small towns like Marion County didn't get much excitement these days, and Wheeler had grown used to filling the long stretches of silence with the sound of his own boredom. Beside him, Deputy Tyler Case sat with his feet up on the dashboard, sunglasses sliding down the bridge of his nose as he scrolled mindlessly through his phone. 26, fresh out of academy training, Case still carried that reckless air of someone who thought he had something to prove, even though he hadn't yet figured out who he was proving it to. His boot thumped against the dash as he glanced over at Wheeler with a crooked grin. "Another day in paradise," Case muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Wheeler didn't respond right away. He shifted in his seat, pulling his hat back just enough to squint at the empty road ahead. "Yeah," he grumbled. "Real action-packed." Both men knew nothing ever really happened out here. A few noise complaints, maybe a drunk driver on the weekends if they were lucky. But mostly it was just this sitting, waiting, killing time between calls that hardly seemed worth getting out of the cruiser for. The radio crackled suddenly, slicing through the lazy quiet like a blade through soft paper. Both men straightened instinctively, as if some part of their training still knew how to respond on cue, even when their minds had already checked out hours ago. "Unit 3. The dispatcher's voice came through the static. "We've got a suspicious female at Red Oak Gas and Diner. Caller reports possible drug activity, unknown behavior. Respond code 2. Wheeler raised an eyebrow, turning the volume up with the edge of his knuckle. "Did she say drug activity?" Case asked, leaning forward already, sounding more interested than he had all afternoon. Wheeler let out a low whistle, a slow grin creeping across his face. "Looks like Sharon's finally got herself some entertainment," he muttered, shoving the keys into the ignition. The cruiser rumbled to life with a mechanical groan. Case adjusted his sunglasses, snapping his seatbelt into place with a little more force than necessary. "Bet it's just another lost college kid passing through," he added, though the way his voice carried it didn't sound like he'd be too disappointed if it turned out to be something more. As they pulled onto the road, Wheeler glanced at his partner, the grin never leaving his face. "Don't matter who it is. Sharon's calling it in like she always does. Let's go stir the pot a little, break up the boredom." Case chuckled under his breath, shifting in his seat like he was already playing out the confrontation in his head. Both men knew the rules, knew how to handle a call without turning it into a scene. But somewhere deep down, neither of them had much interest in playing by the book that day. They cranked up the sirens for show, more for their own amusement than any real sense of urgency, letting the sound bounce off the empty streets as they picked up speed. Wheeler's hands tightened on the wheel, his knuckles whitening just slightly as the cruiser barreled past familiar landmarks, the old post office, the boarded-up bait shop, the rusted swing set in the churchyard. As they neared the edge of town, the landscape flattened into open fields, the road stretching out like a ribbon toward the horizon. In the distance, they could just make out the faded sign for Red Oak Gas and Diner, barely swaying in the sticky afternoon air. Wheeler eased off the gas, his jaw setting into something harder, something colder. Case leaned toward the window, eyes narrowing behind his dark lenses as he spotted the silver SUV parked near the side of the building. A lone figure stood by the rear bumper phone pressed to her ear, completely unaware of the trouble rolling toward her. "There she is," Case muttered, already reaching down to unclip the strap on his holster. Wheeler didn't say a word. He just pressed his foot down a little harder, feeling the gravel spit out from under the tires as they pulled into the lot. And just like that, the boredom was gone. Ariel stood there steady as ever, the weight of the humid Mississippi afternoon pressing down on her skin like a damp, heavy cloth. She shifted slightly on her feet, adjusting the blazer on her shoulders, as she listened to the voice on the other end of the secure line. Every word being relayed to her was critical coded language, live updates, movements that only a handful of people on this earth were authorized to hear. She nodded softly, even though no one could see her, her eyes sweeping the lot with casual precision, cataloging every vehicle, every shadow, every face that lingered a little longer than it should have. From where she stood, she could still smell the faint sour mixture of gasoline and fried grease drifting from the diner's vents. A fly buzzed near her ear, circling lazily before darting off toward the trash can by the building's side wall. Ariel didn't flinch. She was trained for moments like this, trained to stay calm, to keep her body language relaxed, even when her instincts whispered that something wasn't quite right. Years of service had taught her to read a room, even when that room was an open parking lot under a burning southern sky. Her voice remained low, controlled as she answered the next question from command acknowledged. Standing by for further directives. She shifted her weight again, casually resting her elbow on the hood of the SUV, as if she had all the time in the world. But inside, she knew time wasn't on her side. She could feel the signal faltering again, the line crackling slightly in her ear, and the last thing she needed was to lose this connection before the orders were complete. Across the lot, the small group of locals by the front entrance of the diner had started to take notice. Their idle conversations slowed their heads, turning slightly toward the woman standing alone near the edge of the property. Ariel felt their eyes on her the way you feel heat from a flame before it touches your skin. She didn't have to look directly at them to know what they were thinking. She had seen that look in too many places: rest stops in Texas, diners in Alabama, gas stations in Georgia. That slow, narrowing gaze that started as curiosity but turned almost imperceptibly into suspicion. Still, she held her ground, determined to finish the call and move on without incident. She could almost hear her late father's voice in the back of her mind, calm and steady, like it had been when she was a little girl, standing on the porch of their family home. "Keep your head high, baby girl," he used to tell her. "Never let 'em see you flinch." And so she didn't. Not then, not now. She adjusted the phone slightly, stepping toward the rear of the SUV, trying to catch another bar of signal as the secure line flickered again. She knew she needed to wrap this up quickly. She knew she was drawing attention, but the mission came first. It always had. That's what the uniform meant. That's what the oath required. And she wasn't about to fail now, not when she was this close. What she didn't see, what she couldn't have known, was that less than a mile away, 2 deputies had already flipped on their lights, cutting across the highway like they were heading towards something far more dangerous than a woman making a phone call. Their cruiser chewed up the gravel as they accelerated toward the diner, sirens silent for now, but lights flashing bright against the endless blue sky. Ariel glanced down at the phone again, the voice in her ear growing faint, broken by static. She cursed under her breath, trying to move toward clearer reception, unaware that every step she took was bringing her closer to something she hadn't asked, for something she didn't deserve. She had come here for silence, she had come here for duty. But something else entirely was about to find her first. And somewhere deep inside, though, she didn't yet know why, Ariel felt her stomach tighten, not with fear, but with something colder, something sharper, something that told her this day wasn't going to end the way she'd planned. The moment Ariel heard the low growl of tires scraping across the gravel lot, she knew something had shifted. It wasn't the loud screech of sirens or the blaring horns that you see in movies. It was quieter, sharper, like a blade sliding out of its sheath, cutting through the lazy rhythm of the afternoon without warning. She didn't turn right away. Years of discipline had taught her to hold her ground, to never let instinct steal the upper hand, because sometimes it's the stillness, not the movement, that keeps you alive long enough to choose your next step wisely. She kept the phone pressed to her ear, the voice from command still feeding her updates, though the signal was crackling again, fading in and out like a distant radio signal lost in a storm. Her body remained still, but her mind sharpened, her senses heightening the way they always did when something felt wrong. Ariel's eyes, shielded slightly by the brim of her cap, flicked toward the reflection in the diner's greasy window. 2 figures had stepped out of the cruiser, one tall and wide-shouldered, moving like a man who never expected to be challenged, and the other leaner, quicker, his hand twitching near his belt like he was already daring her to make the wrong move. The SUV's hood felt cold beneath her palm as she slowly lowered the phone, disconnecting the call with one deliberate press of her thumb. She let her fingers rest flat on the cool metal, grounding herself, steadying her breath. She didn't raise her hands right away. She didn't need to. Not yet. She just stood there like she had 1,000 times before, waiting for the moment when words might still matter. "Good afternoon, officers," she called out, her voice calm, steady, wrapped in the kind of professional courtesy that only years of carrying rank could teach you. "How can I help you today?" The older one, Wheeler, according to the stitched name tag on his chest, took 2 heavy steps forward, jaw-tightening, eyes narrowing like he'd already decided who she was, without hearing a single word. "License and registration. Now!" He barked, his tone sharp, impatient, like she'd already failed some invisible test by simply standing there breathing the same air as him. Ariel didn't move too quickly. She knew better. She kept her hands visible, her movements slow and deliberate, every breath measured like she was defusing a bomb instead of reaching for her wallet. "Absolutely, officer," she replied, her voice never wavering. "My identification is in my back pocket. I'm active duty military Brigadier General Ariel Hayes, on official federal orders." The younger deputy, Case, let out a dry, disbelieving chuckle as he circled the rear of the SUV, his sunglasses sliding down just enough for her to see the flicker of arrogance in his eyes. "General, huh?" he scoffed, shaking his head like she'd just told the punchline to the worst joke he'd heard all week. "You expect us to believe that—" Ariel ignored the bait. She carefully unfolded her wallet, pulling out her military credentials and her printed federal travel orders. She held them out with steady hands, offering the documents like she'd done 100 times before in cities and checkpoints, where those papers had always meant something. Wheeler snatched them from her grip without so much as a nod. He glanced at them for less than 2 seconds before shaking his head, his lip curling as he tossed them onto the hood like they were trash. "Fake," he said flatly, like the word itself carried the weight of a verdict. For a moment, Ariel just stood there, her breath catching in her throat, the sting of disbelief flashing hot behind her eyes. She opened her mouth to speak again, to clarify, to de-escalate, but Wheeler was already stepping closer, his hand moving toward the cuffs on his belt with a speed that made her heart lurch. "Turn around!" he snapped, pulling the steel restraints free with a loud metallic click that echoed louder than it should have in the open air. Ariel planted her feet, swallowing hard against the rising burn in her chest. She could feel the eyes of the locals still watching from the diner entrance, their quiet murmurs threading through the air like static. She glanced toward the window, locking eyes with Sharon Ellis, who stood smirking behind the counter like she was watching a show she'd seen too many times before. Ariel knew that look. She knew what came next. Squaring her shoulders, she raised her chin just slightly, locking her gaze on Wheeler without blinking. "You're making a mistake," she said softly, not as a plea but as a fact. "I am Brigadier General Ariel Hayes of the United States Army. I am on official duty and I am not resisting." But they didn't care. Wheeler grabbed her arm first, jerking it behind her back with more force than necessary, his grip tight enough to bruise. Case wasn't far behind, grabbing the other wrist and snapping the cuffs into place so roughly that the cold metal bit into her skin. Ariel clenched her jaw, forcing herself not to react, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She let out a slow breath through her nose, staring straight ahead at the diner window, her reflection fractured and smeared by the grime. She could feel the weight of humiliation settling over her like wet concrete, heavy and suffocating. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she wondered if the voice on the other end of the disconnected call had heard the last few seconds, the tension, the shouting, the sound of the cuffs snapping shut. And though she stood perfectly still, her heart pounded in her chest like a drumbeat she couldn't control. She thought again about her father, about every lesson he'd taught her about walking tall, even when the world tried to cut you down. But in that moment, standing cuffed in a cracked parking lot in the middle of nowhere, she wondered if there was any height left to stand on when they'd already decided you were beneath them. And so she stood there breathing silent, staring at nothing at all, knowing this wasn't the end, but knowing too that whatever came next had already begun. Ariel stayed perfectly still, not because she was afraid, but because moving felt like surrendering to something she refused to acknowledge. The metal cuffs bit into her skin with every pulse of her heartbeat, but she knew showing discomfort would only feed their egos. So she focused on the weight of her own breath, counting each inhale like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground beneath her. She could feel Wheeler's heavy presence behind her, standing too close, tightening the cuffs again, not because he needed to, but because he could. She let her eyes drift toward the sky for a second, finding the thinnest strip of cloud stretching across the afternoon blue, almost like a crack in the facade of this godforsaken moment. She thought about how many times she had worn a uniform that demanded respect, how many times she had walked into rooms where men twice her rank stood when she entered, not because they liked her, but because they had to. Here, though, none of that mattered. Here, she was just another body on a curb, knees pressed against hot concrete wrists, bruising beneath steel that didn't recognize her authority or her humanity. Case circled in front of her again, crouching slightly like a predator, inspecting prey that refused to squirm. He leaned in closer than necessary, so close she could smell the faint sting of cheap aftershave mixed with sweat. His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "What's your real name?" he sneered quietly, like this was some kind of joke. "Who you working for? You sure don't look like no general to me." Ariel didn't move. She didn't flinch. She locked eyes with him, holding his gaze with the same unflinching resolve she'd used on enemy lines and arrogant commanders alike. "You already have my name," she replied, her voice so quiet and sharp that it landed like glass breaking between them. "And you already have my orders. What you don't have is the sense to recognize who's standing right in front of you." She watched something flicker behind his sunglasses, something that looked a lot like hesitation, but just as quickly it was gone, replaced by a bitter laugh, as he stood back up and looked over at Wheeler like they were both in on some private joke. Around them, the small crowd had started to shift. More people had gathered now, some stepping closer, some holding their phones higher, the glow of their screens catching in the corner of Ariel's eye. It didn't matter to them what was really happening. They didn't care about the truth. They were here for the show, for the chance to say they saw it happen with their own eyes, for the chance to play the video back later like it was a cheap rerun of someone else's humiliation. Wheeler's voice rumbled low behind her again, almost like he was thinking out loud. "Obstruction. Resisting." Could add that to the report. He laughed softly under his breath, but there was no humor in the sound. Ariel closed her eyes for a moment, pressing her lips together to keep the words she really wanted to say locked tight behind her teeth. She knew the game they were playing. She knew how quickly they could twist a lie into paperwork that would follow her for the rest of her life if she gave them the smallest excuse to write it down. She shifted slightly on the curb, lifting her chin just enough to make sure they heard her. "Contact your supervisor," she said firmly, louder this time, her voice carrying toward the crowd. "You're making a serious mistake, and I'm telling you to stop before it gets worse for both of you." But they didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. Wheeler reached down, grabbing her arm again, forcing her to stand with a sharp yank that nearly threw her off balance. Ariel bit the inside of her cheek to keep from reacting, the taste of blood sharp on her tongue. He spun her toward the SUV, pressing her chest against the metal door with a force that rattled the frame. She could feel the heat of the metal through her blouse, the vibration of his breathing in the space between them. "You don't give the orders here," he whispered so close she could feel the words on the back of her neck. Somewhere behind her, the secure phone still lay on the ground face down on the asphalt, the last remnants of the disconnected call flickering uselessly on the cracked screen. Ariel knew the Pentagon had heard enough to raise every flag they had. She just didn't know how long it would take for that warning to reach this parking lot. She glanced sideways, catching Sharon Ellis once again, leaning in the doorway of the diner, arms, crossed eyes sparkling with something ugly, something smug. Ariel could almost hear her voice in her head narrating the scene for the others inside. "Look at her!" Thinking she's somebody. Ariel clenched her jaw tighter, swallowing the flood of anger that threatened to rise like fire in her throat. And just when it felt like the weight of it all might crush the last bit of air from her lungs, the radio on Wheeler's belt crackled to life. It was a sound so sudden, so sharp, it cut straight through the haze. Both deputies froze their bodies, tensing like they already knew whatever came next wasn't going to be good for them. "Unit 3, confirm you have detained the subject," the dispatcher's voice crackled through the static. Wheeler reached for the radio slowly, like his hand weighed 100 pounds. "Affirmative," he replied, though his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier. "Female, early 40s, non-compliant." There was a pause long enough to make the air feel even heavier. "Be advised." The dispatcher continued, her voice suddenly clearer, sharper, like the weight of Washington itself had just landed on the frequency. "Subject is flagged federal. Repeat, flagged federal. Pentagon has initiated emergency contact. Release immediately and await further instructions." The blood drained from Case's face so fast, Ariel almost felt sorry for him almost. Wheeler's mouth opened slightly, like he wanted to argue with the voice on the other end, but no words came out. He fumbled with the keys to the cuffs, his fingers shaking just enough for Ariel to notice. She didn't move. She didn't help. She just waited. When the cuffs finally clicked open, she slowly brought her arms back to her sides, rolling her wrists to shake off the sting. She turned around to face them both, her expression unreadable, her voice so calm it felt like ice cutting through the air. "You'll regret this," she whispered, not as a threat but as a promise. And from the way their faces shifted pale and uncertain, she knew they believed her. The silence that hung in the air after Ariel's words felt thicker than the heat pressing down on the cracked asphalt beneath her feet. It stretched long and uncomfortable, wrapping itself around every breath like a rope pulled just a little too tight. She stood there, rolling her wrists slowly, as Wheeler fumbled with the cuff key, the metal digging one last time into her skin, before the lock finally gave way. She didn't bother rubbing her wrists. She let the red mark sit there exposed, undeniable. Some wounds didn't need to be hidden. Some needed to be worn like armor. Wheeler took a step back, shifting his weight like the ground beneath him had turned to quicksand. Case, still clutching his belt with both hands like it might anchor him to something solid, dropped his gaze to the ground, unable to meet her eyes anymore. For a split second, it almost looked like they might try to explain themselves, might scramble to piece together some weak excuse about how they didn't know who she was. But the words never came, because the truth was hanging there between them, too heavy to dodge, too big to shrink down into something they could justify. Behind them, the small crowd that had gathered earlier began to stir, the energy shifting like wind changing direction before a storm. Some of the bystanders lowered their phones, glancing at one another, as if realizing they were no longer just spectators to someone else's humiliation. They were witnesses now. Nobody was laughing anymore. Nobody was whispering. They were holding their breath, waiting to see what Ariel would do next. Ariel turned her head slightly toward the diner, her eyes finding Sharon Ellis still standing behind the window, her arms crossed tight over her chest. But this time, the smirk was gone. Sharon had taken a half-step back, like the ground had tilted beneath her feet, and she was suddenly unsure of her place in the scene she had been so eager to set in motion. Ariel held that gaze for one long, deliberate heartbeat, not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted Sharon to remember. Remember what it looked like when the story flipped, when the person you tried to diminish stood taller than ever in the wreckage you created. The sound of engines roaring into the lot broke through the thick silence like a thunderclap. Ariel didn't flinch. She didn't have to look to know what it was. She felt the shift in the air, felt the ground hum beneath her boots, as a convoy of black SUVs from Barksdale Air Force Base swarmed into the parking lot, their tires grinding against the loose gravel, like they had come to take back something that had never belonged to this place to begin with. Doors flew open in perfect unison, boots hitting the ground with sharp precision. The air seemed to ripple with a different kind of authority now, not the empty bravado of small-town deputies, but the calculated, trained presence of federal military security. Colonel Darren Mosley emerged first, his frame cutting through the lot like a blade through thick brush. He carried no weapon in his hands, no need for showmanship, just a folder tucked tight under one arm and a glare sharp enough to freeze every inch of the parking lot in place. He crossed the distance with long, deliberate strides, his boots leaving small clouds of dust in his wake. His eyes never left Ariel, not once until he stood just a few feet in front of her. "General Hayes," he called out, his voice cutting through the charged air, low but clear. "Are you injured?" Ariel lifted her chin, squaring her shoulders, letting them all see she was still standing, still breathing, still unbroken. "No, Colonel," she replied, her voice steady, almost too calm. "Nothing permanent." "But the damage—" She let the words trail off, leaving the weight of that unfinished sentence hanging between them like a loaded weapon. Mosley's jaw flexed as he turned toward Wheeler and Case, his expression shifting into something colder, something heavier. "You are hereby ordered to stand down pending federal investigation," he announced, his voice like a hammer falling on stone. "Any further action on your part will be considered obstruction of justice." Wheeler's mouth twitched like he wanted to argue, like he needed to claw back whatever authority had just been ripped from him. "We didn't know who she was." He stammered, his voice breaking apart like dry wood snapping underfoot. Mosley didn't blink. "That's not an excuse," he replied, his words slicing through the air with surgical precision. "You had her identification. You had federal orders in your hand. You chose to ignore both." Case tried to straighten his posture, tried to puff his chest like he still had something left to prove. She was acting suspicious, he muttered weakly, but even as the words left his mouth, they fell flat, landing like dust on concrete. Mosley stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make every word feel heavier, more personal. Number. You saw a black woman standing alone, and you made a choice based on your own bias. That choice is going to follow you for the rest of your life. Ariel didn't speak. She didn't need to. The truth was already standing in the air between them, thick and undeniable. She turned toward the convoy without another word, walking toward the open door of the nearest SUV, like she had done 1,000 times before, head high, shoulders back, leaving wreckage in her wake. The security team closed ranks around her without being asked, their movements, sharp and silent, forming a human wall between her and the deputies who no longer looked so sure of themselves. As she climbed into the back seat, she let her gaze drift back one last time, catching a final glimpse of Wheeler wiping sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. Sharon Ellis was nowhere to be seen, already gone, scurried back inside the diner like a shadow fleeing from the light. The door closed with a heavy final thud, sealing her inside the cool, dark interior of the vehicle. She leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes for a long moment, letting the hum of the engine beneath her feet steady the chaos swirling in her chest. The air smelled of leather and cold air conditioning, but beneath that, she could still taste the bitter smoke of what had just burned to the ground behind her. She wasn't angry, not yet. She wasn't shaking, not anymore. What she felt was colder than that, cleaner, sharper, like the edge of a blade sliding into its rightful place. She knew what was coming next. She knew the fight was far from over, but for now she allowed herself one breath, just one deep and steady, filling her lungs with the quiet knowledge that the tide had already begun to turn. And this time the whole damn country was about to see it. Far from the cracked pavement of that Mississippi gas station, beyond the reach of the sticky air and restless onlookers, the Pentagon's Command Operations Center was a different kind of storm. It didn't hum with wind or shake with distant thunder. It vibrated with something colder, something sharper, the quiet, controlled chaos of people trained to keep the country running even when the ground felt like it was shifting beneath their feet. The glow of dozens of monitors cast pale light across tense faces, every operator locked in, listening, watching, calculating. Lieutenant Commander Bryce Hanley leaned over his console, eyes fixed on a single blinking dot pulsing on the digital map in front of him. The label beneath it read, Jen Hayes Secure, but the irony wasn't lost on him. That signal hadn't moved in over 7 minutes. 7 minutes in operational time felt like 7 hours. And the secure audio line? It had gone dead not long after the signal froze. All they'd caught were faint bursts of static, distant voices, too garbled to make sense of, and the sound of something sharp, maybe a struggle cutting through the line before silence swallowed everything. He tapped his earpiece again, almost instinctively, like willing the connection back to life with nothing but stubborn breath and quiet desperation. He could still hear her voice in his mind, calm and clipped as always. General Hayes verifying identity, initiating secured connection. That had been minutes ago, but it might as well have been hours. Behind him, Colonel Dana Sharp crossed the floor with the kind of purpose that made people step aside without being asked. Sharp was the kind of officer who didn't have to raise her voice to get results. One glance from her was enough to set an entire floor in motion. She stopped just behind Bryce's chair, folding her arms across her chest, her eyes narrowing as they locked on the same unmoving signal. Status, she asked, her voice low, but Bryce knew better than to mistake low for calm. Signals frozen, ma'am. Bryce replied, his voice rougher than he intended. Last ping puts her at a gas station just outside Mosswood. Sharp let out a slow breath, her jaw tightening as she leaned in closer. Audio. Bryce shook his head. Dead. Last contact was compromised. No clear words, but definitely a struggle. Couldn't isolate. Sharp didn't waste time second-guessing. Get me Barksdale security on priority 1. She ordered, her voice cutting clean through the hum of the room. She turned toward the operations technician already dialing into the secure military line. Full federal deployment authorization. Now, the technician nodded, fingers flying over the keyboard as he relayed the order, his headset pressed tight against his ear. Bryce glanced up, meeting Sharp's eyes for a heartbeat longer than protocol usually allowed. Ma'am, he started, his throat dry. If that signal's still accurate, she's not moving. Sharp didn't flinch. I see it, she replied, her voice tighter than before. And that's the damn problem. The technician raised his hand again, signaling confirmation. Barksdale convoy en route, estimated arrival 5 minutes. Sharp didn't miss a beat. Put JAG on standby. I want Civil Rights Council looped in before wheels touch down. Bryce swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. This wasn't just a security breach. This wasn't just a field complication. This was political, legal, explosive. And if anyone on that ground had laid hands on General Hayes without cause, they weren't just looking at internal reviews, they were looking at federal charges. Maybe worse. He leaned back slightly, running a hand over his face, trying to clear the image burned into his mind, the way her voice had shifted in that final moment before the line cut out. She hadn't panicked. Ariel Hayes didn't panic. But there had been something there, something even a secure line couldn't hide. Frustration, containment, the quiet breaking point of a woman who had seen too much, carried too much, and was still standing. Get me a visual confirmation on that location, Sharp pressed, stepping closer to the main map display. I don't care how small that town is, someone's got traffic cameras, street cams, phones, anything. Bryce nodded, pulling up every data channel they had clearance for. It wasn't much. Mosswood wasn't exactly on the list of places wired for national surveillance. But if someone had a camera phone, if anyone had streamed a clip or posted a photo, Bryce knew they could find it. They had to find it. As the team moved faster, cross-referencing social media feeds, local news scanners, and open-source platforms, Bryce felt the air shift again. This wasn't just about protecting a federal officer anymore. This was about what came next, what the public would see, what the Pentagon would have to answer for, what the country would demand. And sitting there staring at that unmoving dot on the map, Bryce knew one thing. For certain, whatever had happened in that parking lot wasn't staying in Mosswood. Not this time. The air in that parking lot had shifted again, but this time the weight didn't fall on Ariel. It fell squarely on the two men who had just realized their next breath could be the one that ruined their entire careers. The dispatcher's voice still echoed faintly from Wheeler's belt radio, like the final nail being hammered into a coffin neither of them could climb out of. Ariel watched the color drain from their faces, watched the arrogance crack right there in front of her like cheap glass dropped on concrete. For a long moment, neither man moved. Wheeler's jaw twitched as though he wanted to speak, wanted to push back, but nothing came out except the faint grinding of his teeth. Case shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking anywhere but at her, like a man trying to vanish into thin air. But there was nowhere to go. Not now, not after what they'd done. The weight of the Pentagon's shadow had finally caught up to them, and it was pressing down on their necks like a hand they couldn't shake off. Ariel didn't move either. She stood perfectly still, her arms hanging at her sides, her breathing, even refusing to give them the gift of seeing her shake or break. Every second that passed felt heavier than the last, but she let the silence sit there like a blade hanging between them. They had wanted to humiliate her in front of strangers. They had wanted to strip her of dignity without consequence, but now the roles had shifted, and she could feel the ground tilting beneath their feet, not hers. Wheeler fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking just enough for her to notice. The cuffs clinked and scraped as he struggled with the lock like it had suddenly become too complicated for him to manage. When the cold steel finally popped open, Ariel didn't move right away. She let the cuffs fall from her wrists, the weight of them landing on the ground with a soft metallic thud. She didn't rub the red swollen skin. She let the marks sit there, raw and visible, because some things deserved to be seen for exactly what they were. She stepped back slowly, rolling her shoulders, once feeling the tension crack through her spine like a quiet warning shot. And then with a voice so low it felt like it carried the weight of every injustice she'd ever survived, she spoke. "You're going to regret this," she whispered. Not like a threat, but like a promise. A quiet, undeniable truth that neither of them could outrun now, no matter how fast they tried to backpedal. Wheeler swallowed hard, but his mouth stayed shut. Case turned halfway toward the cruiser, like his legs wanted to move before his mind could stop them, but it was too late. The sound of engines, deep and synchronized, rolled into the lot like thunder on the edge of a storm. The first black SUV swung wide into view, followed by 3 more, each moving with mechanical precision. Ariel didn't need to turn around to know exactly who was inside. She had heard that sound before, in war zones, in motorcades, in moments when protocol turned into action. She stood her ground as the convoy came to a stop, boots hitting the ground in rhythm, as the security team from Barksdale Air Force Base closed in. The team moved with sharp, silent urgency, their presence cutting through the heavy air like the tip of a spear. And leading them as she knew he would be was Colonel Darren Mosley, tall, sharp-eyed, and walking with the kind of purpose that made lesser men shrink back before he ever spoke a word. He crossed the distance quickly, not wasting a single breath on pleasantries. His voice rang out clear and sharp as he approached. "General Hayes, are you injured?" Ariel didn't look away from Wheeler when she answered. "No, Colonel," she said, her tone flat, her words cutting deep. "But their careers are." The air shifted again, sharper, now colder, as if the entire lot had been vacuum-sealed under the weight of what had just been said. Mosley turned his gaze on Wheeler and Case, his face carved from stone, every muscle in his jaw tight enough to snap. "You are hereby ordered to stand down," he announced, his voice, leaving no room for argument. "You are to remain in place pending a full federal investigation. Any further action on your part will be considered obstruction of justice." Wheeler tried to open his mouth, but no sound came out. Case took a half-step back, like his body was finally catching up to the disaster unfolding around him. Mosley didn't flinch. He took another step forward, lowering his voice just enough to let the words carry like iron to the bone. "You had her identification. You had her federal orders, and you still chose to ignore them. That choice is going to follow you for the rest of your life." Neither deputy moved. Neither spoke. Because they knew it was over. They knew the world outside, that tiny town, had just broken through their bubble of control. And this time there was no walking it back. Ariel turned toward the nearest SUV, walking toward the open door without another glance at the men who had tried to take everything from her. The security team moved in around her, forming a protective wall of bodies between her and the small, silent crowd that was still watching phones, still raised faces pale, with the sudden realization that they had just witnessed something much bigger than they could understand. She climbed into the back seat, her body sinking into the cool leather as the door shut with a heavy final click. The noise outside dulled to a low hum, but she could still feel the burn in her wrists, could still hear the echo of their voices in her head. She leaned back, closing her eyes for just a moment, letting the air conditioning wash over her skin like the first breath after breaking the surface of deep water. And as the convoy began to move, tires crunching softly over gravel, Ariel knew this wasn't the end. But for the first time since the cuffs had locked around her wrists, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, it was finally the beginning of something bigger. The ride back to Barksdale Air Force Base was filled with a silence so thick it felt alive, pressing down on everyone inside the convoy like a second skin. The engines hummed low and steady, their rhythm almost hypnotic, as the black SUVs rolled down the endless stretch of highway, passing fields of tall grass that swayed beneath the weight of the fading afternoon light. Ariel sat in the back seat of the lead vehicle, her body angled slightly toward the window, her eyes tracing the blur of telephone poles flickering by like ticks on a clock she couldn't slow down. Her fingers rested lightly on the leather armrest, her thumb brushing absent-mindedly over the edge, as if trying to scrub away the sting still burning on her wrists. She didn't speak. She didn't shift. She just sat there, breathing quietly, every part of her body locked in place, like she was afraid if she moved even an inch, the anger simmering beneath her skin might spill out into the small space around her. Colonel Darren Mosley rode in the front passenger seat, his posture straight as a rail, his jaw tight enough to crack stone. He scrolled through live updates on his secure tablet, every flick of his finger controlled every glance at the screen sharper than the last. Every now and then he checked the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Ariel's reflection in the glass. But he didn't speak, not yet. He knew better than to fill the space with words she wasn't ready to hear. Some silences needed to stretch before they could break. The convoy pressed on the sunlight, slipping lower with every mile, until the shadows grew longer, and the sky began to darken into a deep, heavy blue. Ariel let her gaze drift to the horizon, her jaw flexing as her mind replayed every second of what had happened back in that parking lot. The cuffs, the laughter, the crowd, the smug face of a woman who didn't even have the decency to hide her pleasure. It all swirled together in her chest like smoke, thick and choking. And then, after what felt like a lifetime of holding it all in, Ariel finally spoke, not loud, not sharp, but steady, like she had already measured the weight of every word before letting them go. "They're going to spin it," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the tires on the asphalt. "They're going to call it a misunderstanding, say they were just doing their job, frame it like it was nothing more than a routine check." Mosley didn't turn to face her. He kept his eyes forward, his voice low and firm. "We won't let them." Ariel let out a slow breath, pressing her palm against the cold glass of the window, the coolness grounding her for just a second. She had heard those words before, from advisors, from officials, from people in suits who knew how to deliver promises with perfect posture and empty hands. She had said them herself, standing behind podiums trying to convince others that systems could change if you pushed hard enough. But tonight those words felt thinner than ever, stretched tight over a reality that refused to bend. She didn't respond. She just closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of everything press deeper into her bones. For a woman who had spent decades walking through doors where her rank commanded respect, she had never felt smaller than she had today, reduced to nothing more than a stranger's suspicion and a pair of steel cuffs on a stranger's whim. The convoy slowed as they neared the base gates, the flashing security lights casting brief strobes across the darkened vehicles. Armed guards stepped forward to verify clearance, their hands resting on holstered weapons, their eyes scanning each face with mechanical precision. Ariel watched them work, knowing they were just following protocol, knowing none of them had the power to stop what had already happened, or undo what had already been set in motion. As the gates creaked open, the convoy rolled through, turning down the main road that led toward the command center. The familiar sight of the base rows of buildings lit by sterile floodlights, the hum of generators in the distance, should have brought her some small measure of comfort. But tonight it felt cold, sterile, like a stage, waiting for another battle she hadn't chosen but couldn't walk away from. The SUVs came to a slow stop in front of the main operations building. Mosley finally turned in his seat, looking back at her with a quiet intensity that said more than words ever could. "They're already drafting statements," he said, his voice low but steady. "The Pentagon's coordinating with DOJ. Civil Rights Division is involved. This isn't going to stay quiet, General." Ariel nodded, her face unreadable. She reached for the door handle, pushing it open before Mosley could offer to help. She stepped out into the thick night air, the weight of the day settling over her shoulders like armor she couldn't take off. Her legs ached from the tension, but she forced herself to move one step at a time toward the building that held her next fight. She didn't wait for Mosley. She didn't wait for anyone. Her footsteps echoed softly on the pavement as she approached the wide glass doors, her reflection staring back at her under the harsh fluorescent lights. She paused for just a second, her eyes locking on the woman in the glass, the woman who had stood alone in that parking lot, stripped of rank, stripped of dignity, and still refused to break. And in that moment she made herself a quiet promise. She was done waiting for permission to speak. She was done swallowing her voice for the sake of appearances. They had tried to reduce her to nothing, but tonight she would remind them exactly who she was. Squaring her shoulders, she pushed open the door and stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. By the time the sun fully dipped below the horizon, the news had already beaten them to it. The first shaky, grainy cell phone video hit social media less than an hour after Ariel stepped into the command center, uploaded by someone standing across the lot at Kelly's diner. Someone who hadn't stepped in, hadn't spoken up, but had made damn sure the world could see. It didn't take long for that video to catch fire. It never does when the story looks the way this one did. A black woman in plain clothes, standing with her hands raised, explaining who she was, while two white officers laughed, cuffed her, and pushed her into a car like she was nothing. No one needed context. No one waited for explanations. The headline had already written itself before any reporter typed the first word. Ariel stood in the small briefing room watching it all unfold on the wall of monitors in front of her. News anchors shook their heads, their voices dipped in carefully rehearsed outrage, reading statements from veteran organizations demanding accountability. Civil rights advocates appeared on split-screen panels, their faces tight with a mix of anger and exhaustion, calling out racial profiling, abuse of power, and the betrayal of one of the military's highest-ranking black women. And Ariel, standing silently in the back of the room, felt the walls closing in. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew the machine had already started spinning faster than anyone could stop it now. Colonel Mosley stood off to the side, his arms crossed tight over his chest, his jaw set like concrete. He hadn't said much since they returned, only stepping in when Pentagon officials began flooding the phone lines with calls. Legal teams, press advisors, military spokespeople scrambling to control a narrative that was already beyond their reach. Everyone wanted her statement. Everyone wanted her to sit down with their people, read from their script, let them frame it as a learning moment for the department. But Ariel knew better. She had seen this dance too many times. Apologies with no teeth, statements with no soul, Promises made in front of cameras, only to be buried beneath paperwork the moment the public stopped watching. She let her hands rest on the back of the empty chair in front of her fingers, curling tightly around the cold metal frame. The video played again on the largest screen the moment Wheeler tossed her credentials on the hood, the way Case shoved her toward the SUV, the sound of the cuffs snapping closed while she stood perfectly still. And for a moment, she wondered how many times the country would watch those same 10 seconds on repeat, how many strangers would argue about what they thought they saw, never knowing the weight of what it felt like to stand there and live. The hum of the room felt distant now, like she was standing underwater, her heartbeat louder than the voices swirling around her. She knew they were waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to sign off on their version of the truth. But her voice didn't belong to them. Not tonight. Maybe not ever again. She pushed back from the chair, stepping toward the door without a word. Mosley caught her eye as she passed, but he didn't try to stop her. He just nodded once as if to say he understood. Maybe he did. The hallway outside was quieter, the hum of the overhead lights, the only sound filling the space as Ariel made her way toward the exit. She stepped out into the night air, the wind cool against her skin carrying the faintest hint of jet fuel from the nearby runway. The sky stretched wide and dark above her stars, flickering faintly like distant witnesses who had seen it all before and knew they'd see it again. And as she stood there breathing in the weight of everything that had already happened and everything that was still coming, she felt a single, undeniable truth settle deep in her chest. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning, and this time she was going to tell it her way. The press didn't wait for permission. They never do when blood is already in the water. By the time the sun rose the next morning, every major network had picked up the story. It played out on screens in coffee shops, in living rooms, on smartphones, clutched tight by hands that had seen too many headlines like this before. The video looped on repeat, each pixelated second burned deeper into the national conversation. No soundbite could soften it. No carefully crafted statement could undo what the public had already seen with their own eyes. The local police department tried first scrambling to get ahead of the outrage like a man trying to outrun a wildfire with nothing but a garden hose. Chief Vernon Grady, a man more comfortable giving hunting tips than handling national press, stood in front of a row of cameras, his cowboy hat pulled low, sweat beading on his forehead like the Mississippi humidity had turned against him. He cleared his throat once, then again gripping the edges of the wooden podium, as if the right words might somehow rise up through the grain. "We regret the misunderstanding," he began, but the words fell flat before they even hit the microphones. The reporters didn't flinch. They didn't shift. They just leaned in closer pens, scratching cameras rolling, waiting to see if the man behind the podium had anything else worth hearing. Grady stumbled through the usual lines: officers placed on administrative leave, internal review, pending full cooperation with federal authorities. He tried to paint it as an unfortunate mistake, a breakdown in communication, a moment of confusion blown out of proportion. But everyone watching knew better. Everyone could see the cracks in his voice, the fear in his eyes. Not fear for the woman they had cuffed, but fear for what it meant now that the country was watching. A reporter from Baton Rouge stepped forward, her voice cutting clean through the noise like a scalpel. "Chief Grady, why were trained officers unable to recognize military credentials clearly presented to them on scene? And do you believe race was a factor in their decision to detain her?" The question hit harder than any of the others. Grady shifted his weight, glanced off to the side like he was searching for an escape. But there wasn't one. Not today. He muttered something about heightened tensions, about mistaken identity, about protocol, but his voice cracked halfway through. He knew it didn't hold. The cameras knew it too. The crowd outside the police station, dozens of local residents who had gathered overnight holding signs demanding answers, they knew it most of all. Meanwhile, inside the department, the walls were closing in on Wheeler and Case. Their names had leaked before the sun came up, splashed across headlines, trending on social media faster than anyone could control. Past complaints started surfacing, allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, misconduct that had been quietly buried under paperwork for years. But not this time, not with this woman, not with the entire country standing witness. Civil rights attorneys from New Orleans and Washington, D.C. announced they were filing official federal complaints on Ariel's behalf. Veterans organizations issued statements condemning the treatment of one of their own. Even the governor of Louisiana broke his silence, calling the incident an appalling miscarriage of justice against a national hero. It wasn't just about Ariel anymore. It never really had been. It was about every person who had ever been doubted, every voice that had ever been silenced, every badge that had ever been weaponized against the people it was supposed to protect. And as Ariel watched it all unfold from her quiet corner of the base, standing just beyond the noise, she felt the weight of something far bigger pressing against her chest. Not fear, not anger, but the crushing, undeniable truth that even after all the medals, all the missions, all the service, none of it had been enough to stop what had happened in that parking lot. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing through the heaviness, feeling the familiar ache of carrying something no one else could truly understand. She knew this wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever stood in her shoes, silent and unseen, waiting for someone to finally say what they couldn't. And standing there in the stillness, Ariel made herself another quiet promise. They wouldn't spin this into a headline and move on. They wouldn't rewrite her dignity into a press release. Not this time, because she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. By the time Ariel stepped into the conference room the next morning, the energy inside Barksdale had shifted again. What had started as a ripple had grown into a storm, swirling through every hallway, every office, tightening the air like a drum stretched too far. The room was packed not with cameras or reporters, but with people who knew how to turn moments like this into controlled statements, into press releases, into legal strategies, designed to move just fast enough to look like action, but slow enough to buy time. Pentagon officials lined one side of the table, their faces tight with carefully measured concern. Military legal advisors filled the other folders stacked in front of them like sandbags holding back a flood. Colonel Mosley stood by the door, arms crossed, saying nothing but watching everything. The only person who didn't seem to be moving at all was Ariel. She sat at the head of the table, back straight, hands resting on the smooth surface in front of her, her eyes locked on the folder bearing her own name. For the better part of an hour, they ran through timelines, statements, legal exposure, the chain of command. They asked her to recount everything again, every word, every movement, every second of that afternoon at the gas station. And she did. Not because she wanted to, but because she knew the value of precision when the truth was already on the verge of being swallowed by politics. She spoke in the same voice she had used on battlefields in strategy rooms, in front of soldiers who trusted her with their lives. Calm. Clear. Without hesitation, she didn't let the weight of the moment bend her spine. She didn't let the exhaustion slip into her voice. Every word she spoke carried the weight of a woman who had already calculated the cost of staying silent and decided she wasn't willing to pay it anymore. Across the table, one of the legal advisors leaned in slightly, her voice lower than the rest. "Ma'am, the Department of Justice has opened a civil rights investigation. They'll be sending federal attorneys to interview you later this week." Ariel nodded once, saying nothing at first. Then she let her gaze sweep the table, landing on every face staring back at her. "What's the Pentagon's position?" she asked, her voice as steady as it had been the day before. The room shifted. A few glanced down at their notes. One cleared his throat. Another pressed his lips tight together like he was biting down on a script he wasn't sure how to read aloud. Finally, the lead counsel leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. "The official position is being drafted," she said carefully. "But they are encouraging restraint in public statements until the investigation concludes." Restraint. Ariel almost laughed, but it never made it past her lips. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest as she let the weight of that word settle between them. She had been asked for restraint her entire career. Be patient, be professional, don't make it about race, don't embarrass the institution, don't be the headline. She looked toward Mosley, catching his eye for just a second. He didn't flinch, he didn't look away, and in that silence between them she knew they were thinking the same thing. If she didn't speak, someone else would. If she didn't control the story, the people who had already tried to control her would shape it for her. Ariel leaned forward again, resting her elbows on the table, her voice lower, sharper. "They want me to wait, but I'm telling you all right now, I'm not waiting for permission to tell the truth." No one argued, no one pushed back, because they all knew she had already earned the right to speak louder than any of them. When the meeting ended, when the last page was closed, when the door finally clicked shut behind the last advisor, Ariel stayed in her seat a moment longer. She stared at her own name on that folder, feeling the weight of it settle differently now, not as something that belonged to the system, but as something she was ready to carry on her own terms. And when she finally stood pushing her chair back with a quiet scrape across the floor, she knew exactly what came next. She wasn't just going to stand behind someone else's podium. She was going to stand in front of every camera, every microphone, every person who had ever doubted someone like her, and she was going to say what needed to be said. Not just for herself, but for every person who didn't get a convoy when their rights were stripped away. And this time she was going to make damn sure the whole world heard it. The press conference wasn't held in Washington, not in front of the Capitol, and not inside some polished government chamber where politicians lined up to say the right things for the cameras. Ariel had made sure of that. She knew better than to let someone else's stage frame her truth. That morning she stood just outside the gates of Barksdale Air Force Base on the ground where she had built her career, where she had earned every single stripe, every star, every ounce of respect that still carried weight in the hearts of those who served under her. There was no red carpet here, no polished podium, just concrete under her boots and a plain black microphone, standing taller than most of the men who had once tried to ignore her voice. The crowd had gathered long before she arrived. Reporters, cameramen, community members, veterans, families, holding hand-painted signs that read, "Dignity is not negotiable and accountability now." It wasn't a mob. It wasn't a protest. It felt more like a community holding its breath, waiting for someone finally to say what they had all felt in their bones for far too long. The air was thick, not with anger, but with something heavier expectation. Not for spin, not for polished statements, but for something real. Colonel Mosley stood off to the sidearms, crossed jaw, set like stone, watching her with the quiet intensity of a man who had seen 1,000 operations unfold, but knew this moment would leave a deeper mark than any of them. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to remind her what was at stake. She already knew. Ariel stepped up to the microphone, her full-dress uniform sharp, and cleaned the rows of medals on her chest, catching the soft morning light. She didn't adjust the mic. She didn't shuffle her notes. She stood there tall and unmoving, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium, her breath steady as she let her eyes sweep across the sea of faces in front of her. She spoke without a script, without a teleprompter, without permission. "My name is Brigadier General Ariel Hayes," she began, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the heavy silence like a bell tolling at dawn. "I have spent 29 years serving this country. 29 years standing for the values written into the Constitution. 29 years leading men and women in uniform who trust me to bring them home with dignity." She paused, letting the weight of that number settle like a stone on the crowd. But yesterday, in a parking lot in Mosswood, Louisiana, she continued, her voice sharpening. None of that mattered. The words landed like thunder, rolling across an empty field. "I was not judged by my record, not by my service, not by the uniform I have earned the right to wear," she said, each word falling heavier than the last. "I was judged by the color of my skin, by assumptions made the moment I stepped out of my car by two officers who didn't see a leader or a citizen, they saw a target." She let her hands drop to her sides, unclenching the fists she hadn't realized she'd been holding since the moment she left that parking lot. "I am not here today for an apology," she said, her voice dropping lower but sharper. "I am not here to make anyone comfortable. I am here because silence is not an option." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but she didn't pause. Accountability matters. Respect matters. Human dignity matters. And none of these are negotiable based on someone's prejudice, someone's ignorance, or someone's badge, she said, locking eyes with the cameras, now speaking not just to the people standing in front of her, but to every home across the country, where someone was watching, holding their breath, waiting to hear someone speak the truth. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the mothers standing with their children, the veterans standing with their hands clenched tight, the officers standing at the edge of the crowd, unsure if they should look proud or ashamed. And for a moment she let herself see all of them, not as an audience but as the people this moment truly belonged to. "Injustice is not new," she continued, her voice softening just slightly. "But change only happens when enough people refuse to look away. When enough people refuse to accept the lie that respect must be earned twice by some and given freely to others." She paused again, the air so quiet she could hear the buzz of a single insect somewhere near the microphone. "I was not humiliated yesterday," she finished, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "They were. And history will remember it that way." She stepped back from the podium without another word, without waiting for questions. The applause started small, almost hesitant at first, like people were afraid to be the first to break the silence. But it grew. It spread through the crowd like fire catching dry grass, not the polite clapping of reporters or the staged applause of political events, but something real, something alive. And as she turned to leave, as the roar of voices followed her back toward the gates of the base, Ariel didn't walk faster or slower. She walked the same way she always had, steady, unshaken, carrying more than her own name on her back. Because she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It never had been. The press conference ended, but the ripple it sent through the country was just beginning to rise. The footage spread faster than anyone could have predicted, clipped into short sound bites that flashed across every network, played on loop by anchors who leaned into their microphones with solemn faces, repeating her words like they had only just realized what they meant. Social media feeds lit up with hashtags, comment sections flooded with arguments, and talking heads debated her every sentence as if dignity was something up for public interpretation. But Ariel didn't watch any of it. Not that night. She didn't return to the operations floor where legal teams waited with statements to draft and questions to frame. She didn't head back to the secure briefing room where staffers huddled over laptops trying to calculate what came next. Instead, she walked the long stretch of concrete leading toward the edge of the base, her boots landing soft but steady on the ground, that had carried her through more battles than she cared to count. No one followed her. No one called her name. And for the first time in days, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a release. The sun hung low on the horizon, burning the sky in shades of orange and violet, the kind of quiet beauty most people missed while they scrolled through headlines looking for someone else's outrage to consume. Ariel didn't miss it. She walked until the buildings faded behind her, until the hum of engines and the static of radios melted into nothing but wind and breath. She stopped when she reached the old chain-link fence that marked the edge of the airfield, a forgotten boundary where the world seemed to pause. She let her hands rest on the cool, rusted metal, curling her fingers through the wire like she used to do. As a young cadet standing on the edge of parade grounds staring out into futures, she hadn't dared speak aloud. The air smelled like rain, heavy and full, even though the clouds had yet to open. She closed her eyes, let her head tilt slightly toward the sky, and breathed in the stillness, something that couldn't be scripted or managed or spun into someone else's narrative. Her body ached in places she had learned to ignore, old wounds, new bruises, the deep-set fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. But what weighed heavier wasn't what had happened to her. It was knowing how many times it had happened to others, how many stories had gone untold, how many voices had been swallowed by silence, because the world only seemed to care when someone with stars on their shoulders stood in front of a microphone and forced them to listen. She thought of the soldiers she had led, the women and men who had followed her into places most people would never see. She thought of the letters she had written to families who never got to welcome their loved ones home. She thought of every door she had walked through, every battle she had fought, not just in uniform but in boardrooms, in hallways, in moments where the only weapon she had was the sound of her own voice, refusing to be silenced. And somewhere in that quiet she thought of her father again. His voice always steady, always soft, reminding her that dignity wasn't something people gave you, it was something you carried, something you held onto even when the world tried to strip it away. Especially when the world tried to strip it away. She opened her eyes slowly, tracing the distant line where sky met earth, where the runway stretched out like a road with no clear end. She knew the fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But standing there with the wind pressing against her skin and the weight of the country still buzzing just beyond the fence line, she felt something else stir inside her, something that felt a lot like peace. Not the kind of peace that comes when battles are finished, but the kind that settles in when you know you've done what needed to be done, when you've said what needed to be said, and when you've stood tall in the face of people who expect you to bow. She had carried herself through humiliation, through headlines, through a moment that could have crushed anyone who hadn't spent their life learning how to stand back up. And now, standing on the edge of the base that had shaped her, she knew exactly who she was. She wasn't just the woman in the video. She wasn't just the headline in the news. She wasn't just the general who had been handcuffed in a parking lot by two men who hadn't bothered to look beyond her skin. She was every woman who had ever been doubted, every soldier who had ever been underestimated, every voice that had ever been told to wait its turn, and she wasn't waiting anymore. She let her hands fall from the fence, straightening her back one last time as the sky began to dim. She turned away from the horizon, her footsteps light but sure, retracing the path back toward the base, back toward the people who had stood with her when it mattered most. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she was ready to meet it. Because when you've carried the weight of silence for too long speaking, the truth doesn't feel like a risk, it feels like freedom. And Ariel Hayes had never been more free. She walked into the night with her head held high, leaving nothing behind but the quiet certainty that she would never be silenced again. Sometimes in life you can do everything right. Work hard, live with dignity, dedicate your life to your family, your community, or your country. And still, there will be people who look down on you simply because of things you cannot change, like the color of your skin, your age, or where you come from. The story of General Ariel Hayes reminds us of one powerful truth: no one has the right to take away your dignity unless you let them. Whether you're retired or still walking your journey, remember this: dignity is not something others give you. It's something you carry with you even when no one else sees it. Sometimes all it takes is standing firm, speaking the truth, and holding your head high, because you might be the strength someone else has been waiting for. And if you're listening to this right now, know this: your voice, your story, your courage, they still matter, they still carry weight, and they can still change something in this world. Never let anyone silence you. Wherever you are, no matter your age, remember your voice still matters. If this story touched your heart, if you believe dignity and truth deserve to be heard even more, take a second to hit that like button. Click subscribe to stay connected with us, and share this video with someone you care about. Because every share, every subscription helps us keep telling powerful stories like this one and keeps the flame of justice burning in our community. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story.